All right, Jim, let's get some more questions here this week. And this next one was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Morris. I always heard that Vince McMahon and Dusty Rhodes had heat prior to Dusty going to WWF in 1989. I also heard, because of this heat, that's how Virgil got his name. Is any of this true?
Well, the Virgil part, yes, is pretty much
but was it due
gimme.
to heat? But was it due to heat, or was it a rib? How do you see that?
It wasn't. No, there was no heat per se of a personal issue that Vince McMahon Jr. and Dusty Rhodes had in the past amongst them, otherwise than Dusty is the booker and the lead babyface for Vince's only competition in the 80s. There was the professional competition. But there was, and it was a rib as far as, making a flunky, giving him the real first name of the, flag bearer for the other company. But no, there wasn't personal animosity between Vince and Dusty that would prevent them from occupying the same room. And that's why Dusty went to work for him when the TBS executives were not as enamored of Dusty as Crockett had been. So that's that. I mean, we could manufacture a bunch of ill will, but there was nothing to keep either one of those guys from doing business with each other, except in the previous 5 years, Dusty had been the football coach and team captain for the other side.
With Dusty as your coach, did he ever mention Vince in the sense that, it was his competitor, but he actually knew the guy. It wasn't like someone who he had never met before, like, oh, that goddamn mystery man, I hate him.
Yeah, no.
It was someone he knew, someone he had worked with and for before.
Yeah, well, he had worked for Vince's father.
He was there in 83. That means he worked for Vince Jr.
You son of a gun. He sure was that 1 year, wasn't he? Okay.
He did an MSG. He was still working MSG shows, and whether people knew it or not yet, Vince Jr. from June 82 on owned the company.
Yeah. And Vince had also been the TV announcer during the 70s when Dusty was making all those garden shows in the major Northeast arenas. Vince had a relationship with Eddie Graham in Florida, going back to, obviously, Eddie Graham was one of the biggest stars that his father had in the late 50s, early 60s in the Garden, the Graham brothers, etc., two different teams, Jerry and Eddie, and then Jerry and Luke when Eddie went to Florida. But they always had good relations, and all of the WWE, bigwigs had homes in Florida. And there was an element of talent trading back then, which is why Kevin Sullivan, some of the other guys that had worked Florida, told me that every once in a while, Eddie Graham would want to book Dusty out so that he could get somebody else over in his own territory. Because if Dusty was there, nobody was getting over Dusty. But if Dusty was gone, you could get somebody else over. And then when Dusty came back, he had both of them, which is why he would be, booked out to those big shows. And they've had the Dusty and Superstar Graham WWF title matches. They had them on the network. They've been on DVDs. I don't know where they are now in the Peacock scheme of things, but those matches sold out. Dusty and Superstar was a big match for New York at the same time as Dusty was the top babyface in Florida. So that's how he made his reputation, Dusty, and how he got to be a star in so many different places because he wrestled in so many different places. He was in demand. So again, he had been around Vince, knew Vince. It was just the way he would refer to Vince in the locker room or on the plane or TVs, any meetings with us is, well, we're going to kick Vince's ass in Philly, baby. Not I hate Vince and I want him to die, but we're going to kick his ass when we run that show there. And that's the kind of thing you want to hear from your coach. Just because he's friendly with the fucking coach of the other team you're facing in the Super Bowl doesn't mean that you want him to like that guy better than your own team. So, and that's how he got referred to.
In 89, so again, it kind of ends in a bad way for Dusty with the Turner executives. A lot of people have issues with the booking. You've talked about some of the good points of the booking in the past on the show, and I encourage people who want to hear both sides of it they should seek out those segments and hear them.
Well, and I'm talking about some of the bad parts too, but the thing was the TBS people they didn't know anything about wrestling. So they had no frame of reference an unbiased frame of reference of what was really going on. And they picked several of the top guys to talk to. That's how Tully got the heat, because he knocked Dusty's booking. And then he got kicked off Crockett's plane. And then they left and went to New York. But they were just going by what they heard and decided who to trust in the thing, but they had no idea of what a booker actually really did and of overall context of what he had done for the company and that roster of guys and etc. And then they went nuts when he did the spike in the eye angle and they said no more blood and blah, blah, blah. But he did what he had always done, which was, we're going to heat this thing up and see if I can get it over. Sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. But in that case, he didn't just have to tell Jimmy Crockett, well, all right, this is what we're doing. He had TBS and they didn't know shit from apple butter about anything related to wrestling. They were just hearing about it for the first time. And then they hired Jim Herd, so you can tell that they didn't pick up on a lot to begin with.
Hey, quick question. I want to get back to what my other question was going to be, but I just started thinking about this. Let's go to a perfect world where Dusty doesn't have the problems with the Turner executives at the end of 1988. Whether Crockett still owns the company or not, it doesn't matter for this example.
Right.
But Dusty has still been the booker for almost 5 years. For the most part, in wrestling history, a booker does get tired at a certain point, and they need someone else. Now, Bill Watts owned his company, and he hired other people to be the booker, although he still had input. Do you think Dusty could have ever accepted a role like that if he wasn't worried about his job, so he didn't have to worry about security? Like I said, maybe Crockett owning it would be better, actually. Could Dusty ever have someone like a Bill Dundee, and probably not Bill Dundee himself, but someone like that in that kind of role, where he's not the booker, but he oversees the booker and adds his flair to it? You think Dusty could have ever done what Watts did?
If they had given him a piece of the company, but see, that's that Watts did it because he owned the company, and he could make that change anytime he wanted to. If you have your booker say, okay, we're going to keep you in the job, but you need to hire you a booker, that doesn't make sense. So the bigger thing would have been if Dusty had stayed on as booker and doing what he felt he needed to do. Definitely the first 6 months of 1989 would have been better than it was, because Dusty asleep could have been better than the first 3 months with George Scott, and Dusty just having woke up would have been better than the 3 months of the booking committee. But by then, he would have been working with Jim Herd for 6 months, and the result would have probably been the same as it was with Flair, as it was with everybody else that they hired to be the booker while Herd was around. And he just said, fuck it, and gone to work for Vince. Because Dusty could not have coexisted with Jim Herd any easier than anybody else did. Probably not as well, because Dusty was, based on his track record of success, convinced that he knew better than everybody else. And since everybody else numbered Jim Herd, George Scott, et cetera, he did. But that doesn't mean that Herd would have let him do what he was doing any more than he let anybody else do what they were doing. What it probably would have done is not give us a Flair and Steamboat and Flair and Funk that year. Otherwise,
yeah, Steamboat wasn't going to come back and work under Dusty, I don't think.
Well, and there really wouldn't. He probably wouldn't have called him. The one good thing that George Scott did was, and actually that was already in the works with Jimmy Crockett, I think, but Scott was fully on board with it, was called Steamboat. And if they hadn't done Flair and Steamboat, I don't think that Terry Funk would have just materialized out of nowhere and done that deal also. But otherwise, everything else would have been better. And then, to be honest, when Flair took the book in, August, from that point until he resigned because of Herd, things were up. They'd continued to go up. Everything, the house shows were up slightly, but the ratings were up a lot and the pay-per-views were up a lot. But then, that's the problem is when Flair left, that started a long descent. I don't mean left when he quit as booker, and then he didn't leave for another 6 months or whatever, but that started a long descent that they never really got out of.
Was Dusty going to be able to coexist with Flair going into 89?
They could always have coexisted if it was just the wrestling business without Turner Broadcasting involved. Jimmy Crockett could have got them together some kind of fucking way. And for the sake of everything, they would have done it. But with Turner Broadcasting got involved, everything went to shit.
The question I wanted to ask you before was, so we're going into 89, Dusty ends up doing some stuff in Florida with Mike Graham and Gordon Soley, the PWF. They make him the first world champion. They do a bunch of big things to promote Dusty coming back to Florida. And then he goes to the WWF pretty quickly. Once he realized that wasn't going to actually be a business that he could beat Dusty Rhodes in.
Yeah.
Were you surprised in 89 when all of a sudden he showed up doing those vignettes on WWF TV?
I wasn't surprised. I was kind of downhearted for him. Because that's the trade-off that he made. He could have gone back to Florida and done something like I would do, which he'd to start his own promotion and be happy being home and working towns and being in the wrestling business. Except Dusty couldn't be happy making no money at that point. He'd made money for so long. And the only place he was going to make money comparable to what he'd been making was to work for Vince McMahon. And to go and do that, you had to do the fucking ridiculous pre-TL Hopper plumbing promos and the polka dots and sapphire and the whole 9 yards. And it was nothing related to either what got Dusty Rhodes over in the 70s, which was the psychedelic American dream, funky like a monkey with the floppy fur hats and the coats and the weirdness. And then the 80s was more the Willie Nelson, son of a plumber, kick-ass cowboy type of thing. This was neither of those. It wasn't Dusty. It was clown wrestling when the WWF was starting to be mostly clowny. And so he was making money, but that wasn't Dusty Rhodes. And I hate that a lot of people remember him by that.